Hey, this is another video on this channel about the Cold War, the Arab Cold War to be exact. The reason I want to talk about the Arab Cold War is because I think it's a really interesting period of Arab history and needs to be talked about more. So without further ado, let's start. The Arab Cold War was a period of political rivalry in the Arab world from the early 1950s to the late 1970s as a part of the broader Cold War. The generally accepted beginning of the Arab Cold War was the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, which ultimately led to Jamal Abdel Nasser becoming president of Egypt in 1956. Thereafter, newly established Arab republics defined by revolutionary secular nationalism and largely drawing inspiration from Nasser's Egypt were engaged in political rivalries of varying degrees of ferocity with conservative traditionalist Arab monarchies led by Saudi Arabia. The approximate endpoint of this period of rivalry and conflict is generally viewed as being the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which culminated in the installation of a theocratic Islamic Republic in Iran. Despite the name Arab Cold War, however, the Arab Cold War was not a clash between capitalist and communist economic systems. Indeed, with the exception of the Marxist government of South Yemen, all Arab governments expressly rejected communism and criminalized the activities of communist activists within their territories. Moreover, the Arab states never sought membership of the competing military alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, with almost all Arab states being members of the non-aligned movement. What tied the Arab Cold War to the wider global confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was that the United States backed the conservative Saudi Arabian-led monarchies, while the Soviet Union supported the Egyptian-led republics adhering to Arab socialism. Anyway, since the Arab Cold War began in 1952, we're gonna start in 1951. The year is 1951, and this is the independent Arab world, including Israel. From left to right, the countries are the Kingdom of Libya, the Kingdom of Egypt, the State of Israel, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Lebanese Republic, the Syrian Republic, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the Mutawakkila Kingdom of Yemen. Fast forward a year later, Egyptian Revolution. The Free Officers movement toppled King Farouk of Egypt. The Free Officers, led by Mohammed Najib and Jamal Abdel Nasser, initiated a program to radically change Egypt by dismantling feudalism, ending British influence in Egypt, and abolishing the monarchy and aristocracy. In 1953, they declared Egypt a republic. On 26th of July 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, following the withdrawal of an offer by the United Kingdom and the United States to fund the building of the Aswan Dam, which was in response to Egypt's new ties with the Soviet Union. The United Kingdom and France subsequently entered into a secret pact with Israel to jointly invade Egypt, but were forced to back off in what is known as the Suez Crisis. Nasser emerged from the war with great prestige as the unchallenged leader of Arab nationalism. Nasser employed a number of political instruments in order to raise his profile across the Arab world, from radio programs such as The Voice of the Arabs to the organized dispatch of politically active Egyptian professionals, usually teachers. 1958 was the year of unions. Egypt and Syria joined together to form the United Arab Republic, which Yemen then joined in a loose confederation called the United Arab States. The Hashemite kingdoms of Jordan and Iraq, in response to the United Arab Republic, joined together to form the Hashemite Arab Federation, which technically was a confederation, but it doesn't really matter anyway, because it only lasted for 6 months, because the Iraqi monarchy got brutally overthrown and got replaced by a nationalist republic that same year. After Syria's withdrawal from the UAR in 1961, Egypt retained its United Arab Republic name until 1971. Instead of a federation of two Arab peoples, as many Syrians had imagined, the UAR turned into a state completely dominated by Egyptians. Syrian political life was also diminished, as Nasser demanded all political parties in Syria to be dismantled. In the process, the strongly centralized Egyptian state imposed Nasser's socialistic political and economic systems on a weaker Syria, creating a backlash from the Syrian business and army circles, which resulted in the Syrian coup of September 28, 1961, and the end of the UAR. 1962 saw a coup d'etat in Yemen carried out by revolutionary republicans led by the army under the command of Abdullah Salal, who dethroned the newly crowned Imam Muhammad al-Badr and declared Yemen a republic under his presidency. The Imam escaped to the Saudi Arabian border, where he rallied popular support from northern Shia tribes to retake power, escalating rapidly to a full-scale civil war. Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who were kinda at odds because of historical claims, were both on the same side supporting the Kingdom of Yemen, while Britain gave covert support. Oh yeah, and Israel was there too. The Republicans were supported by Egypt and were supplied warplanes from the Soviet Union. Both foreign irregular and conventional forces were involved. Jamal Abdel Nasser supported the Republicans with as many as 70,000 troops and weapons. Despite several military actions and peace conferences, the war sank into a stalemate by the mid-1960s. In the same year, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had oil, wealth, and prestige as the land of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities of Islam. To use Islam as a counterweight to Nasser's Arab socialism, Saudi Arabia sponsored an international Islamic conference in Mecca. It created the Muslim World League, dedicated to spreading Islam and fostering Islamic solidarity. The League was extremely effective in promoting Islam and also served to combat radical alien ideologies, aka Arab socialism, in the Muslim world. 1967 saw the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War, also known as the June War or the Third Arab-Israeli War, was an armed conflict fought from 5th to 10th of June in 1967 between Israel and an Arab coalition primarily comprising of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. Relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors were not normalized after the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948 to 1949. In 1956, Israel invaded Egypt, triggering the Suez Crisis. Among Israel's rationale for the invasion was its goal of reopening the Straits of Tiran, which had been closed by Egypt for all Israeli shipping since 1950. Israel was eventually forced to withdraw, but was guaranteed that the straits would remain open. A peacekeeping contingent, known as the United Nations Emergency Force, or the UNEF, was deployed along the Egypt-Israel border, but there was no demilitarization agreement between the two sides. In the months prior to June 1967, tensions in the region became dangerously heightened. Israel reiterated its post-1956 position that the reclosure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping would be a definite casus belli. In May, Jamal Abdel Nasser announced that the straits would be closed to Israeli vessels and subsequently mobilized the Egyptian military along the border with Israel, ejecting the UNEF. On 5th of June, Israel launched a series of airstrikes against Egyptian airfields, initially claiming that it had been attacked by Egypt, but later stating that the airstrikes were preemptive. The question of which side caused the war remains one of a number of controversies relating to the conflict. Egyptian forces were caught by surprise, and nearly the entire Egyptian air force was destroyed with few Israeli losses, giving Israel the advantage of air supremacy. Simultaneously, Israeli forces launched a ground offensive into the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, which caught the Egyptians by surprise. Again, after some initial resistance, Nasser ordered an evacuation of the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelis continued to pursue and inflict heavy losses on the retreating Egyptian forces and conquered the entire Sinai Peninsula by the 6th day of the war. Jordan had entered into a defensive pact with Egypt a week before the war began. The agreement included that in the event of a war, Jordan would not take an offensive role, but would attempt to tie down Israeli forces to prevent them from making territorial gains. About an hour after the initial Israeli air attack, the Egyptian commander of the Jordan military received orders from Cairo to mount attacks against Israel. In the initially confused situation, the Jordanians were falsely told that Egypt had repelled the Israeli air raids. Egypt and Jordan agreed to a ceasefire on 8th of June, and Syria agreed on 9th of June. A ceasefire was signed with Israel on 11th of June. In the aftermath of the war, Israel had crippled the entirety of the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian militaries, having killed over 20,000 troops while losing fewer than 1,000 of its own. The sweeping Israeli success was the result of a well-prepared and enacted strategy combined with the poor military and political leadership and strategy of the Arab coalition. At the cessation of hostilities, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, as well as the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel's international standing greatly improved in the following years. The overwhelming Israeli victory had humiliated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, leading Nasser to resign in shame. He was later reinstated after protests in Egypt against his resignation. Meanwhile, the British had withdrawn from the Federation of South Arabia, which had now become South Yemen. By February 1968, the Yemen siege was lifted and the Republicans had essentially won the war. The Royalists remained active until 1970. Talks between the two sides commenced while the fighting went on. The Foreign Minister, Hassan Makki, said, "Better years of talk than a day of fighting." In 1969, yet another Arab kingdom fell, when the Free Officers Movement of Libya, a group of rebel military officers led by Colonel Muammar al-Qaddafi, overthrew the Kingdom of Libya led by King Idris I. In Saudi Arabia, Nasser's popularity was such that some Saudi princes, led by Prince Talal ibn Abdulaziz, rallied to his cause of Arab socialism. The Nasser's plot was uncovered by the Saudi government, involving 28 army officers, 34 Air Force officers, 9 other military personnel, and 27 civilians. By the late 1960s, Nasser's prestige was diminished by the political failure of the Union of Egypt and Syria, and the military failures in Yemen, where the civil war stalemated despite his commitment to thousands of troops to overthrow the monarchists, and especially with Israel, where Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula and 10,000 to 15,000 troops killed during the Six-Day War. In late 1967, Nasser and Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal signed a treaty under which Nasser would pull out his 20,000 troops from Yemen, Faisal would stop sending arms to Yemeni royalists, and 3 neutral Arab states would send in observers. After Nasser's death in 1970, his successor, Anwar Sadat, emphasized religion and economic liberalization rather than Arab nationalism and socialism. In 1970, Saudi Arabia recognized the Yemen Arab Republic, and a ceasefire was effected. The Saudis gave the Republic a grant of $20 million, which was later repeated intermittently, and Yemeni sheikhs received Saudi stipends. In Egypt's shattering 1967 defeat, land, sea, and air had been the military slogan. In the perceived victory of the October 1973 war, it was replaced with the Islamic battle cry of Allahu Akbar, while the October 1973 war was started by Egypt and Syria to take back the land conquered in 1967 by Israel. According to the French political scientist Gilles Kepel, the real victors of the war were the Arab oil-exporting countries, whose embargo against Israel's Western allies stopped Israel's counteroffensive. The embargo's political success enhanced the prestige of the embargoers, and the reduction of the global supply of oil sent oil prices soaring, and with them, oil exporter revenues. This put Arab oil exporting countries in a clear position of dominance within the Muslim world. The most dominant was Saudi Arabia, the largest exporter by far. The war began on 6th of October 1973 when the Arab Coalition, a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria, jointly launched a surprise attack against Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, which had occurred simultaneously with the Islamic holy month of Ramadan in that year. Egyptian and Syrian forces crossed their corresponding ceasefire lines with Israel and invaded the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights respectively. Following the outbreak of hostilities, both the United States and the Soviet Union initiated massive resupply efforts to their respective allies during the war, which led to near confrontation between the two nuclear-armed superpowers. The fighting commenced with a massive and successful crossing of the Suez Canal by the Arab coalition. Egyptian forces crossed the ceasefire line with Israel and advanced virtually unopposed into the Sinai Peninsula. However, Israel mobilized most of its forces 3 days later and halted the Egyptian offensive, resulting in a military stalemate. The Syrians coordinated their attack on the Jordan Heights to coincide with the Egyptian offensive and initially made threatening gains into Israeli-held territory. After 3 days of heavy fighting, Israeli forces has pushed the Syrians back to their pre-war ceasefire lines. The Israeli military then launched a 4-day-long counteroffensive deep into Syria. Within a week, Israeli artillery began to shell the outskirts of the Syrian capital of Damascus, and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat began to worry about the deteriorating integrity of the Arab coalition's leadership. Sadat believed that capturing 2 strategic mountain passes deeper within the Sinai Peninsula would make the Arab position stronger during post-war negotiations with Israel, and subsequently ordered Egyptian forces to mount another offensive against the Israelis, which was quickly repulsed. Israeli forces subsequently counterattacked at the seam between the 2 Egyptian formations, crossed the Suez Canal to Egypt, and slowly began advancing southwards and westwards towards Suez City in over a week of heavy fighting that resulted in large casualties on both sides. On 22nd of October, an initial ceasefire brokered by the United Nations unraveled, with each side blaming the other for the breach. By 24th of October, the Israelis had improved their positions considerably and completed their encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army and Suez City, bringing them within 100 kilometers of the Egyptian capital of Cairo. This development led to dangerously heightened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and a second ceasefire was imposed cooperatively on 25th of October to officially end the war. The Yom Kippur War had far-reaching implications. The Arab world had experienced humiliation in the lopsided rout of the Egyptian-Syrian-Jordanian alliance in 1967, but felt psychologically vindicated by early successes in the 1973 conflict. The Israelis recognized that, despite impressive operational and tactical achievements on the battlefield, there was no guarantee that they would always dominate the Arab states militarily, as they had done consistently throughout the First Arab-Israeli War, the Second Arab-Israeli War, and the Third Arab-Israeli War. These changes paved the way for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. In 1978, the Camp David Accords that followed the war saw Israel return the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and the subsequent 1979 Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty, which marked the first instance of an Arab country recognizing Israel as a legitimate state. Following the achievement of peace with Israel, Egypt continued its drift away from the Soviet Union and eventually left the Soviet sphere of influence entirely. Also, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been suppressed by the Egyptian government, was allowed to publish a monthly magazine, and its political prisoners were gradually released. At universities, Islamists, i.e. people that think that Islam should be incorporated into society, law, and constitution, took control and drove anti-Sadat student, leftist, and pan-Arabist organizations underground. By the late 1970s, Sadat called himself the Believer President. He banned most sales of alcohol and ordered Egypt's state-run television to interrupt programs with Islamic call to prayer on the screen 5 times a day and to increase religious programming. And that's it for the Arab Cold War. See you next video.